All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're extracting some incredibly actionable crisis management strategies from one of the most high-stakes superpower summits in modern history. We're looking closely at a major state visit between American and Chinese leadership, specifically the Trump-Xi summit detailed in our source material. But look, we aren't just treating this as a historical geopolitical event. Instead, we're looking at it as a practical, step-by-step masterclass in how to manage intractable rivals. Think about it. When the entire globe is watching and the stakes are absolutely monumental, how do leaders actually navigate that tension? The strategies they used are a blueprint you can take and apply to literally any high-stakes business negotiation or corporate crisis management scenario.
But before we break down the mechanics, we've got to ask ourselves a massive question about the reality of modern diplomacy. When you have two global heavyweights locked in a trade war, battling over the future of artificial intelligence, and diverging on global security, how do they prevent that intense competition from spiraling into total catastrophe? It's tricky, right? Because when neither side can win outright and neither side wants to escalate things, the traditional rules of diplomacy just don't apply anymore. You need a completely new set of tools.
So here is our roadmap for today. We've got 5 main areas to cover. First, the end of partnership. Second, preparing the battlefield. Third, the strategy of optics. Fourth, compartmentalizing conflicts. And finally, the playbook itself.
Let's start with part 1, the end of partnership, moving from integration to containment. The timeline of this relationship starkly illustrates a profound deterioration, and it proves a really tough point. Economic interdependence absolutely does not grant immunity from rivalry. For decades, the calculation was simple, right? If we integrate our economies, we align our interests. In 1972, Nixon's visit was all about seeking integration. By 2001, China joining the WTO created massive interdependence. I mean, to give you a sense of scale, after 2001, bilateral trade exploded to over $500 billion a year. We shared supply chains, corporate headquarters, university exchanges. It was total enmeshment. But by the late 2010s, that consensus completely fractured. Washington shifted toward containment with tariffs and export controls, while Beijing leaned heavily into self-reliance and strategic autonomy. We went from a partnership of deep integration to a rigid, new era of structural rivalry. And what's fascinating is the sheer contrast between then and now. Summits used to produce these massive, historic breakthroughs, but today, they're designed to produce strict boundaries. Past diplomacy was all about resolving differences and thrilling rapprochements. Think the Reagan-Gorbachev summits or Nixon and Joe Enlai. Modern diplomacy, though, is intensely focused on de-risking. It's an unspoken, pragmatic acknowledgement that structural disagreements just aren't going to be solved over a single handshake. In practice, de-risking looks like actively diversifying your supply chains so a single choke point halfway across the world doesn't bankrupt your whole industry overnight. It's all about building guardrails, not bridges.
Moving on to part 2, preparing the diplomatic battlefield, or the mechanics of damage limitation. This is where the behind-the-scenes stuff gets crazy. The machinery of expectation was deliberately dialed way down. Neither side announced grand ambitions. Instead, they focused entirely on stabilizing friction. Well before Air Force One ever taxied onto the tarmac in Beijing, diplomatic working groups were exchanging dozens of highly technical briefings. They were rigorously testing each other's absolute red lines through quiet back channels, and it gets incredibly granular. Imagine protocol teams physically on the ground with measuring tape to check translation cues and rehearse camera angles. It's an absurd level of micromanagement, but it's entirely necessary. They intentionally used words like pragmatism and responsibility rather than breakthroughs. They were managing expectations by actively, strategically lowering them. And that brings us to a massive paradigm shift. When neither side can win and neither can escalate, preventing failure becomes the ultimate goal. Think of a heavy block teetering right on the edge of a cliff. In a fragmented global order, just keeping the relationship from sliding off that cliff is the actual victory. Relate that to your own worst professional conflicts or corporate negotiations. Sometimes just stopping things from getting worse is the ultimate win, right?
Let's get into part 3, the strategy of optics and what we call the theater of parity. Picture the precise choreography at the Great Hall of the People. There is no bowing, no deference, only strict parallelism to establish a baseline of mutual respect. When the U.S. president stepped off the plane, he was met at the exact top of the stairs, a gesture of absolute symmetry. 21 gun salutes, symmetrical honor guards, flags carefully measured so neither was a single millimeter higher than the other. Why?
Because at this level, any perceived slight, even a mismatched flag height, can be weaponized by domestic audiences back home as weakness. So this isn't just polite ceremony, it is a meticulously crafted visual language signaling that both sides are operating as absolute equals. I absolutely love this insight. When trust is low, ritual becomes a substitute for confidence. When you literally cannot trust your rival's long-term intentions, the absolute predictability of a mirrored hall or a perfectly spaced water glass provides a much-needed psychological anchor. Predictability itself becomes a diplomatic asset. Think about it. When you believe the other party might start a global trade war tomorrow, knowing exactly how they're going to shake your hand today creates a baseline of stability. It substitutes for the trust that simply isn't there.
And then there's hospitality diplomacy, which gives leaders a controlled environment to gauge reactions without committing to actual policy shifts. A banquet menu that physically blends American ingredients with regional Chinese dishes serves as this perfect culinary metaphor for their economic interdependence. Honestly, it's the geopolitical equivalent of a forced family Thanksgiving. You smile, you pass the gravy, and you aggressively avoid talking about politics. It provides an arena where they can share a table, deliver carefully worded toasts emphasizing shared responsibility, and project stability to the watching world, all while remaining structurally cold to one another.
Moving to part 4, compartmentalizing core conflicts. Literally boxing up the friction.
This is how you handle explosive issues. Instead of trying to universally agree on everything, they literally categorize the friction into distinct boxes. They acknowledge the structural rivalry and just contained it. On trade, they established working groups to monitor flows, but neither side offered unilateral concessions. In the tech sector, specifically regarding advanced semiconductors and AI, it was pure containment. Both nations recognized that advanced chips are vital national security assets, not just commercial products, so that issue gets tightly locked away. And in the Middle East, they just accepted their divergence, with China focusing on energy investments and the U.S. maintaining security deterrence. They boxed up the friction so one fiery disagreement wouldn't burn down the entire relationship.
And of course, Taiwan remains the ultimate flashpoint. Compartmentalizing the issue was the absolute only way to preserve the possibility of dialogue on other fronts. The summit didn't magically ease these tensions, but the goal wasn't to solve the issue. The goal was to put it in a box with a heavy padlock so it wouldn't contaminate critical discussions about trade flows or climate initiatives. Both sides used highly deliberate, pre-rehearsed language to fiercely hold their ground without accidentally pulling the trigger. To do this, they lean heavily on something called strategic ambiguity. We've got to clearly define this jargon because it is the exact mechanism that allows deterrence without triggering outright provocation. Strategic ambiguity is a brilliant crisis management tool. Think of it in business terms. It's like telling a rival company, we will fiercely defend our market share without telling them exactly which new product you're launching. It keeps them guessing. It lets both sides state their ultimate boundaries without boxing themselves into a corner where they're forced to act immediately. It buys time, and in a crisis, time is literally everything.
All right, let's bring it all together. Part 5, the crisis management playbook and the rules of modern statecraft.
Understand that this concept of managed rivalry is the new default setting of the 21st century. Tactical cooperation can exist on the margins, sure, but the competition itself is entirely non-negotiable. We are not returning to a post-Cold War partnership, but we aren't inevitably sliding into a new Cold War either. We are living in a state of competitive coexistence. And in this era, diplomacy isn't about building a bridge to a grand, harmonious resolution. It's acting as a heavy buffer to absorb the intense shocks of institutionalized rivalry.
If you take away anything from this explainer today, let it be these 3 concrete steps, because you can use these exact same strategies in corporate disputes or high-stakes business management. First, establish parity. Use protocol, precise optics, and extreme predictability to enforce a baseline of mutual respect when actual trust is at 0. Second, set boundaries. Stop trying to win a decisive breakthrough and instead focus entirely on preventing a catastrophic breakdown. And third, compartmentalize the friction. Put the most volatile issues into their own separate boxes so you can keep the lines of communication wide open on the things you actually can manage. Because the world isn't asking if great powers are going to compete anymore, it's asking if they will compete responsibly. The ultimate takeaway is that in a fragile order, controlling the pace of the rivalry is the true marker of success. This summit didn't produce major global agreements. It didn't solve the trade wars or the tech disputes. But it successfully controlled the pace. It proved that systemic competitors can share a table, communicate limits clearly, and prevent the rivalry from dictating terms to the leaders. So, I'll leave you with this provocative thought.
When you are dealing with a structural rivalry, whether that's an international superpower or an aggressive corporate competitor, maybe the highest form of success isn't destroying them or achieving perfect harmony. Maybe it's managing the rivalry so expertly that the game just keeps being played without everything falling apart. So ask yourself, in your next high-stakes negotiation, is preventing failure your greatest victory? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and take these tools into whatever battlefield you face next.